Um, so I always like it if I come to one of these kind of presentations, somebody just gets right into it without a lot of introductory fluff. So I'll dive right in. I think some of this is a little bit dense. I'm going to try to pause on the parts that I think might need a little bit unpacking. But if you want to interrupt me if there's something you're not following, feel free. Otherwise, we can take some questions at the end. This presentation is about how neighborhoods change in terms of income demographics and to some degree racial and ethnic composition of a neighborhood over time. It looks at census data over roughly the last 20 years from 2000 to 2019, right before the pandemic. And it focuses on the DC region, not just Montgomery County. It was based on methodology developed by a guy named Will Stansel, who is basically a research academic at University of Minnesota Law School, or at least he was when a study using these kinds of approaches was done just a few years ago. He used data through 2016. So this updates that a little bit, adds some other variables that Stansel didn't examine, and really tries to focus on our area. And it's about questions that I think are increasingly at the center of all the debates that we have over land use. You know, when I first started working on this stuff, maybe 15 or plus years ago, most of the debates about real estate development were about traffic, sometimes school overcrowding, compatibility, aesthetics, neighborhood character. Those are the arguments that were usually employed. And I think that we've seen a shift where a lot of the opposition or controversy around real estate development is focused on what I guess I would loosely call progressive land use politics, especially concerns about race, identity, as well as income inequality. And I hope you'll see how that fits in as we work through this. I am trying to look at the question of what is happening in individual neighborhoods in the DC region over a period of a couple of decades. Is there something that we might call gentrification or displacement going on? What do those terms mean? Are those the only phenomena that are important or interesting or that we should be concerned about? And to what degree are those things changing the neighborhoods that we live in? And what are the implications for how we should feel about things like market rate development of new housing? So I'll start with what I call the anti-growth narrative, or I don't mean this in a pejorative sense. I'm just trying to find a way to give you some shorthand of about what is the argument that we often hear about why development in new housing is a bad idea. You might call this the growth skeptical argument, if you prefer, but it basically goes something like this. As an area or neighborhood grows and demand for housing in that place increases, particularly in urban transit-served neighborhoods, developers are buying up naturally occurring affordable housing, maybe garden apartments or modest houses. They're tearing them down. They're replacing them with expensive, quote-unquote, luxury high-rises, much more intensive types of buildings with more units but at higher prices. And that is displacing low and middle income residents both directly by tearing down the housing where they used to be able to live at modest prices and replacing it with housing they can't afford, and indirectly through some type of amenity effects resulting from development of market rate housing in proximity to where they're previously affordable but perhaps still extant, not yet redeveloped properties may be located. And so the story goes that more affluent newcomers are accommodated at the expense of people who make less money, who are in turn pushed out. And I want to suggest tonight, the title of this presentation is Everything You Thought You Knew About Gentrification and Displacement is Wrong, or Almost Everything. I hope that was intended to be provocative. I don't think it's much of an overstatement, though, because I want to suggest that while that story has some elements of truth to it, it's largely misses the mark. So, how can we think about gentrification, displacement, and other ways in which neighborhoods can change in terms of their income demographics? I would suggest that there's 4 different things that can happen in terms of income demographics and what's going on in a neighborhood. You can have the relatively higher or middle income people, the number of those people can go up or down. The number of lower income people can go up or down. Both those categories can up, both of them go down, one can go up, the other go down, vice versa. That's 4 possibilities, right? So you might say, and this is going to be important, so I want to slow down on this, just so you can follow it. You see these 4 boxes here. The green box, tract is expanding economically, it's becoming more perceived as more desirable. People are moving in, generally, want to be there. And the tract has got low-income population growth as well. That's what you might call inclusive growth, right? You can have both economic and physical space for people at both high and middle or low income levels. Second possibility is you could have displacement. That's where the number of lower income people is going down, number of higher middle income people is going up. And that is not exactly the same as saying people are being pushed out, but you might infer that that is a place where displacement is occurring. You could have low income concentration. That's where the high and middle income people are leaving and lower income people are coming in. And then there's abandonment, which is where a neighborhood is in such a state of decline that people of all income levels are getting out. That's not really a thing in the DC region, at least not over the last 20 years, in any significant way in any neighborhood, in any census tract. But it's certainly true in almost every metro area in the country. And in fact, if you went to Baltimore or Richmond or any of the places nearby, you'd see those kind of census tracts, but not here, because we have an economically dynamic place that's generally in demand, growing for a lot of reasons, and that's good. I'm not going to dwell on the criteria here, other than to say it's, as I described, the methodology for deciding just how much the share or number of each one of those income groups has to go up or down to qualify as meeting one of these 4, being in one of these 4 boxes. That was developed by Will Stansel, and we adopted his methodology. It's based on census information, and it's somewhat of a simplification because census demographics by income really only allow you to differentiate between households at 200% of the poverty level or below, or 200% of the poverty level and above. So when I say high and middle, I'm talking about people who make over 200% of poverty level, those households. When I'm talking about low income people, I mean below 200% of the poverty level. I would love it if we had a more nuanced way of taking this apart, but that's the debate that's available, and I think it's useful as far as it goes. Anybody who wants to look at this slide to take it apart, I'm happy to talk to you about it or send it to you, but I don't think we need to dwell on the specific, cut points. So, where are the neighborhoods in the DC region that are experiencing something that we might call displacement? And again, I'm defining displacement to mean that the high and middle income people, it's increasing, low income people, it's going down. You can see these census tracts, see quite a few of them in DC proper, not every census tract in DC, but a lot of them, scattered throughout the close-in suburbs. But you also see places like western Montgomery County out around Poolsville that are also seeing something we could call displacement. Now, most people don't think of a displacement as something that happens in a rural area or even a suburban or exurban area. It's sort of the stereotype, I think it's fair to say, is associated with, mixed-use urban development. You got a bunch of 20-somethings with good jobs, like Amy here, just got out of law school, and they ride around on fixed-gear bicycles. They have ironic facial hair. They like to drink craft beer. And these more affluent hipsters, I don't know if that fits you, Amy. I'm just hope you won't mind. are moving in, and that's putting price pressure on, real estate prices going up, and long time, usually older, perhaps people of color are going to get pushed out. This map, I think, shows you that there are places in the urban core that are transit-oriented, mixed use, that fit that stereotype, that are experiencing displacement, but there's also suburban, exurban, and even rural locations that also are experiencing displacement. And if you think about Western Montgomery County, the ag reserve, it sort of stands to reason because even though it might at first seem counterintuitive, because some people like to live on a big piece of land, see the pastoral landscape of the ag reserve, and to the extent that we have very restrictive land use policies, zoning in the ag reserve, so you can't really build a lot more housing. So as the region grows, there's really a smaller proportion of the people who want to live in those kind of places are going to be able to do that. There's going to be more competition for the available land where you can have a big house on a big lot out in a rural area, but that's still relatively close to DC. Not to pick on the ag reserve, it's true, as you can see from the map, there's a number of these tracts throughout the region of all sort of land use typologies, I guess you'd say. Okay, where is there concentration of lower income households? These are the tracts you might say are in economic decline. Even in DC, there are several of those tracts. Many tracts, not a huge number, but many tracts in the close-in suburbs. I'll drill down a couple in Montgomery County, including the area near Lake Forest Mall and there around Biggs Cheney. But you'll see there's pockets of this where you're seeing more affluent people leaving, more lower income people coming out, again, throughout the region. It's no jurisdiction that's entirely free of that, what you might call, I don't want to say concentration of poverty, because it's really not, again, the definition we're using is less than 200% of the poverty level, but I think it's fair, there's a concentration of low income households going on. Okay, so where is this positive thing going on I was talking about, which is where a neighborhood is drawing in people with money, people who can afford to choose where they want to live, are deciding, yes, this is a desirable location, I want to be there. And at the same time, lower income people are coming in and they have the ability to find a place that they can afford. This is a much smaller group of neighborhoods or census tracts. I'll talk a little bit about the ones in Montgomery County, but you'll see a lot of these are in DC. So yeah, there is a disturbing number of census tracts in DC proper and in some of these close neighborhoods in Northern Virginia that are experiencing displacement, but there's also a number of them that are experiencing inclusive growth, which is a good thing. This is what it looks like when you throw these all together, and the point I want to make with this slide is not just to show you how different neighborhoods can be going in different directions at the same time, even if they're in close proximity to each other, but also that most neighborhoods don't meet any of these criteria because they're not changing materially over a period of the last 2 decades as far as their income demographics are concerned. So I think that many people in the DC region, including Montgomery County, feel like there's so much change going on just like everywhere, all around us. And what I think this illustrates is there are a lot of neighborhoods that were expensive, affluent 20 years ago, and they still are. There's other neighborhoods that are predominantly lower income or predominantly middle income, and they still are. Most neighborhoods kind of go sideways over time. It's not the case that every neighborhood is particularly experiencing abrupt changes in the relative income levels of their residents. This is another illustration of the same thing. This kind of uses a different color scheme to express this idea a little bit differently, which is the orange areas, the ones that were at or above the 60th percentile of income 20 years ago, and they still are. The purple is the neighborhoods that were below the 40th percentile and still are. The yellow are the ones that were between the 40th and 60th percentile and still are. And the white ones are the ones that have changed That's just kind of flipping around and looking at it a little bit differently. Same point. Most neighborhoods are basically staying within roughly the same income band as far as their income demographics go over time. Okay, so looking at what's going on in each jurisdiction in the DC region, I think it's important to look at obviously at the neighborhood level, things can be very different, and each jurisdiction is going through something a little bit different. What you see here is, in Prince George's County, there's more than twice as many neighborhoods or census tracts that are experiencing concentration of poverty as they're experiencing displacement, and only one that has inclusive growth. Montgomery County is a little bit more even, but still 19 census tracts are experiencing concentration of low-income households, 16 are experiencing displacement, and 6, which is actually not bad, are having more of people at high, medium, as well as low-income levels. When you look at Fairfax, it's also pretty even, but flipped around a little bit. And Northern Virginia and DC generally have a lot more displacement tracts than they do tracts where there's concentration of low-income people. So I think the insight here is that the Northern Virginia suburbs and DC are not in the same situation that the Maryland suburbs are, particularly if you exclude Fairfax County, which is kind of similar to Montgomery County. And I would suggest that the focus on displacement is in some ways misplaced. It's a problem, it's a serious issue that we have to grapple with, but we also need to think about the opposite problem, which is neighborhoods that are in decline as opposed to neighborhoods that are attracting lots more people with money and people are getting priced out, because that's not just a different problem, that's a problem that is actually in many ways diametrically, the neighborhoods they have exactly the opposite problem, and I think the solutions or the approaches to what we should be trying to do about it are very different, if not diametrically opposed. Our census tracts are not uniform in terms of their size or geographically or their population. So this is this bar chart just shows how many people are in each of the census tracts that meet each of those criteria. What you see on the left is the comparison. The DC region, excluding Montgomery and Prince George's County, has about 3 times as many people in a tract with displacement going on as with concentration of low-income households. The middle shows Montgomery County. The ratio is about 4 to 3 the other way. 4 people are in a tract that's experiencing concentration of low income versus 3 for every 3 people that are in a tract experiencing displacement. And in Prince George's, it's more than twice as many experiencing concentration of poverty as displacement. To drill down a little bit on Montgomery County, I want to look at a few specific neighborhoods. Fairland Briggs Cheney, because we're doing a plan here right now, there's a lot of discussion in the planning department as well as in the community about should we be encouraging market rate development in Fairland Briggs Cheney, could that cause displacement? Well, as it turns out, what we've seen in the last 20 years in Fairland Briggs Cheney is not a dramatic, but still a pronounced decrease in the number of more affluent households and an increase in the number of lower income households. So not really what you'd expect to see if you have a place that's ripe for displacement or something you might call gentrification. Lake Forest Mall is probably the most extreme case over the last 20 years of decline in terms of the income levels of residents. That's there up by Montgomery Village. Poolsville, I already mentioned, that's that western Montgomery County tract. We're seeing displacement sort of counterintuitively in this relatively rural area. And downtown Silver Spring is the only census tract in the region that strongly displays these characteristics of inclusive growth. And I think that's also kind of a surprise to a lot of people who think of the redevelopment of Silver Spring as being successful in many ways, but perhaps leaving some people out or even pushing some people out. And what you see here is that it's true the percentage change in the higher and middle income population has been dramatic, 240% over the last 20 years. The share of lower income people has declined by 7.4%, but the number has increased by 937 people. So the relative proportion of high and middle income people has increased relative to low income people, but low income people are still accommodated. They're not, I think it's very difficult to make the case that they're being pushed out as a result of new development. Last thing I want to point out about this slide, and we'll get into this a little more, look at that fourth column, change the number of housing units. Downtown Silver Spring is the one tract of those four that's seen a dramatic increase in the number of new housing units over the last 20 years, over 4,000 units. Really, very few new housing development projects in those other tracts. That's not surprising if you're in a neighborhood that's in relative decline in terms of the income levels of people who can or choose to live there. Real estate developers generally are looking for places where they can expect some kind of price appreciation. That's just, business. So they're unlikely to develop in a place where the relatively higher middle income people are leaving. In the case of places that high income people are coming in, you would think that they would like to build something there, but we have relatively restrictive zoning, which is true of the Ag Reserve. It's true of a lot of neighborhoods in DC, where the height limit, historic preservation, zoning rules that are intended to limit the amount of new development. And so you can't accommodate more demand with new housing, or not very much of it anyway. So that, I think, is pretty interesting. And if you look at the whole region and all the tracts that meet these criteria, you see that that pattern holds true pretty strongly. You see that the tracts where there's inclusive growth going on are the ones that have really probably at least 4 times as much housing being built as tracts these other categories. Places where there's displacement, you see relatively little housing. Places where there's low income concentration, even less. And in Montgomery County, you can see those numbers, same pattern holds true. And so there's limits to how much we can really draw inferences about causation there. You can't really say that more housing necessarily always prevents displacement. You could have a situation where there's so much new demand that housing can't keep up. But I think it's very hard to argue, based on this data, that new housing is causing displacement. It may or may not be sufficient to reduce the pressure on real estate prices, but I don't think, I think it's fair to say that it's not it's part of the solution, not part of the problem. Looking at downtown Silver Spring more specifically, you can kind of see this at work in tracts that are doing different things that are right next to each other. See that top tract, these don't line up quite with the CBD because of the way the census tracts are drawn, but generally speaking, that green one is most of the central business district. The area to the north there, it says 295 units, that's the census tract where I live. And then you see east and south also have evidence of displacement going on. Well, it stands to reason that if you built 4,000 new units over the last 20 years, you have accommodated, yes, there's a lot of market rate development. There's also a lot of moderately priced dwelling units that have been created. And there's also less competition for the previously existing naturally occurring affordable housing. So if you're relatively low income, if you're middle income, if you're high income, and you want to live in a central business district, which means you want to live in a multifamily, an apartment building, condo, something like that, chances are you can find something that will match your income and preferences in downtown Silver Spring. Not so much in the surrounding neighborhoods where you can't build much, and in terms of quantity, and also the only options you have per our zoning are to build single-family houses, maybe in some cases townhouses, but even that's pretty limited. You see that red track there on just the west side of downtown. That includes the Falklands, and I think that's because there were some units that were renovated with low-income housing tax credit. So you did see some increase in the number of relatively lower-income households, but I don't think in this case that that's necessarily a bad thing. It means that there's people of lower income that are now have the opportunity to live in income-restricted housing. It's right next to downtown Silver Spring, and transportation, the amenities, all the things that downtown Silver Spring has to offer. What does this mean as far as race is concerned? Well, people of color are not necessarily poor. And in Montgomery County, it's definitely the case that we see middle and higher income African Americans, Latinos, Asians, who have moved into almost every part of the county in greater numbers over the last 20 years. In Silver Spring, we added about 2,200 black residents over the 20 years that are covered in this analysis, and actually that was just a few short of the number of white residents who are added. The proportion of white residents is way up, but again, the number of both black, white, and for that matter, Asian and Latino residents is also up. So there is no necessarily rigid, the increase or decrease in number of relatively higher middle income households, lower income households, not coterminous with the racial demographics of the neighborhood. In fact, you can see neighborhoods are accommodating a lot more people of color, even as you are also accommodating a lot more white people, and the people of color are not necessarily lower income. It shouldn't be that surprising, but I think sometimes people make those assumptions even if they're not really thinking about it very hard. These are our best fit lines, which show scatter plots for the relationship between increase in the number of housing units in a census tract and the change in the black population or the Latino population. The left one is the change in the black population, Montgomery County related housing units. Right is Latinos. What you see is that the line is sloped a little bit more steeply for black residents than for Latinos, but the relationship is positive in both cases. So more housing is, I think, statistically significant for black residents, increasing, not statistically significant, but certainly, at the margin, positive for Latinos as well. And that's also true of the DMV. This is just the region-wide look at the same thing. But you see those scatter plots are like real messy, right? The dots are all over the place because that tends to show this relationship is not very, very strong, right? And that is an important insight in itself, is that the relationship between the racial demographics and displacement on the one hand, or concentration of low-income households on the other, is not as strong as I think a lot of people assume. So, what does that growth skeptical narrative get wrong? It is true that poor people or lower income people are being pushed out of some neighborhoods, but there's a lot of other neighborhoods that have exactly the opposite problem, which is that high and middle income people are moving out and low income people are becoming to be the predominant income group. And that's particularly true in Montgomery and Prince George's County as opposed to the rest of the region. Also, the places where low-income residents are getting placed are not the places where you're seeing a lot of new housing. In fact, the neighborhoods that have the most development of new housing, market rate, as well as income-restricted housing, are the ones where there's a lot of housing getting built. And the places where there's the most displacement are the places where there's a lot of people want to live, but you can't grow to accommodate that. I also want to mention there's this idea of tearing down existing naturally occurring affordable housing and replacing it with luxury high-rises. That is overall definitely not happening. It could happen on the basis of an individual building, but as far as neighborhoods, Bethesda in particular, a lot of people mention it, like, oh, there's a lot of development in Bethesda, everything getting redeveloped in Bethesda. I think somebody who I talked to earlier tonight mentioned this. Yes, right over here. It is true that there are some buildings where you may get a net loss of housing at a lower price point with redevelopment. But so far, since the Bethesda downtown master plan was adopted in 2016, there have been 1,841 new units of housing built. That has included 270 new income restricted units in the moderately priced dwelling unit program, because they have a 15% requirement for moderately priced dwelling units in all new development in Bethesda. And only 14 units of any kind have been demolished. And those were not all affordable. That was, there were some single family houses there, a couple smallish apartment buildings, but they were not income restricted, and in a couple of cases at least, they were not naturally occurring affordable units. But so we got almost 20 times as many income restricted affordable housing units as a result of the downtown Bethesda plan as the total number of all housing units that were demolished to make way for redevelopment, which is, I think, not what some people will tell you. So the economic theory is straightforward, right? It predicts that more supply is going to take the edge off or even reduce prices. But some people say, no. Housing markets are different. The theory doesn't apply in practice. And I think this data that we've collected shows that, in fact, what you learned in your freshman economics class in college does, in fact, operate in local housing markets, and including in the DC area and Montgomery County. So the real world evidence is consistent with the theory and inconsistent with the what a lot of growth skeptical people will tell you about the effect of housing, how the housing market actually operates. So that's what I've got, and I would welcome your questions. You want me to turn this off, or you?
I'll come and get it, please.
Ronit.
Your data cuts off in 2019, right?